Hi everyone, my name's David Malone, my pronouns are he, him, and I am the head of the Gender Equality Steering Group here at Maynooth University. We're delighted you could make it along today to the Maynooth University Annual Intersectionality Lecture. Just a little note that this lecture is being recorded, so if you don't want to be part of the recording, please don't pipe up in the chat or anything like that. Maynooth University has been created to being an inclusive place really since its foundation in 1997. The university has a longer history than that, but starting even in 1998, we've had the Maynooth Access Programme, which has been promoting wider access to the university from underrepresented groups. MAPS helped embed things like accessibility and diversity into the culture of the university, and importantly into policies and practices to support students who come to join us. Maynooth University is also part of the University of Sanctuary programme, where we can welcome refugees and asylum seekers and other migrants who wouldn't usually easily be able to make it into our university community, and help them get involved and become a part of the community. There's a number of sanctuary scholarships for students who are asylum seekers or refugees who don't have access to normal state supports for their studies. Maynooth University has also recently been very active in the Scholars at Risk network. That's a network whose mission is to protect scholars and promote academic freedom. There is a Fellows at Risk, a fellowship for scholars at risk to support academics or research staff who are forced to flee their home country too. We realise that inclusivity and diversity is not really ever a finished job, and that there's always a lot more to do. And so we're always interested in trying to improve our policies, embed it in our culture, and help our people support an inclusive and diverse environment. Now, to that end, we have a wonderful equality, diversity, inclusion and interculturalism office, which is headed up by Dr. Gemma Irvine, who is our Vice President for Equality and Diversity. The team does wonderful work both with staff and students to educate us and improve our outlook on the world, and to tackle racism and ableism, and basically help us all improve our attitudes to equality and diversity throughout the university, covering scholarship, teaching and all aspects of university operation. So while EDI is everybody's responsibility, we have this very important office helping us support that role. So in fact, Gemma was supposed to be here today to introduce this talk, and unfortunately she can't make it. And I am this backup plan to the backup plan. I'm in the UK today, and this introduction is if I can't make it also in person. To introduce our speaker properly today, we have Chandana. Chandana is our co-chair of the MU Intersectionality Working Group, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. And she's going to introduce our speaker properly today, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hear it for the Intersectionality Lecture 2022. So Chandana, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. This lecture has been organized by the Maynooth University Intersectionality Working Group. We've also had a huge amount of help from Gemma Irvine and her colleagues, Jenny Rothwell, Sam Blankensee, and Jill Keogh, and thank you all very much. It's my privilege now to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Abayomi Ogunsanya. Dr. Ogunsanya received his doctorate from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, where he specialized in the anthropology of media. He's been a Cadbury Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham and an African Humanities Program postdoctoral fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He has taught at the University of Ibadan and at Ocean State University in Nigeria. Until in 2018, his advocacy of minority rights so irked the Nigerian government that he was forced to leave the country and seek asylum in Ireland with his young family. They were immediately placed in direct provision when they came to Ireland. He decided to treat this immensely difficult time as an occasion for research and conducted participant observation fieldwork with fellow asylum seekers for more than 2 years. He and his family have now been granted refugee status in Ireland, and he's currently working on a project with NASC, the Migrant and Refugee Rights Center in Cork. He has also been, at the same time, writing an ethnography based on his fieldwork within direct provision centers, and his lecture today will draw on that material. It's a great honor to welcome Dr. Ogunsanya to Maynooth and to invite him to speak to us now. Dr. Ogunsanya.
Thank you very much for having me. I thank you all for signing up to listen to this lecture, and special thanks to the organizers for extending an invitation to me to deliver the lecture. My talk will endeavor to cover two parts that are intertwined. In the first part, I will talk about what is already a common knowledge, that is, things that are known in scholarly circles and that are less stridently discussed outside academia. In the second part, I will tell you what you may like to know, that is, things that many of you may not know and that you hope will be part of this talk. This second part, which will be about sharing my experiences in the context of the topic of this lecture, is presented by C. Vivek Shrava, who raises the important question, and I quote, "Why is my humanity only seen or cared about when I share the ways in which I have been victimized or violated?" Now, unlike Ashawalia, who in her book Border and Rule bluntly and I quote her, refuses anthropological consumption, at the end of quote, as a response to this onerous question, I realized that as an anthropologist, I am duty-bound to share my experience, if perhaps in the established tradition of autoethnography. Now, this is because I speak, if you will pardon the conceit, for a subaltern community, a community at the margin of society. Now, marginal communities like this, which is a shorthand for powerless peoples living in contexts that have been rendered invisible to the mainstream by state policies and different structures of oppression and practices, have occupied the attention of many anthropologists since the late 20th century. From Sabo locations in parts of Nigeria to favelas in Brazil, from traveler halting sites in Ireland to asylum camps spread across different parts of the world, communities in the margins of society are becoming increasingly visible as sites of oppression, and anthropologists have made it an important part of their vocation to bring them to the mainstream. Direct provision, Ireland's system of interning people requesting protection, provides a good example of a space of incapacity and marginality where we may explore the relationship between agency and structure and the intersectional experience of race, disability, and social isolation, three discursive sites crucially relevant to my preoccupation in this lecture. Now, relying on time spent in the system between 2018 and 2021, which I construe as a form of participant observation, I will attempt to show how that precarious structure and policy that is direct provision is also a site of oppression. I should say quickly that in electing to speak from a position that privileges my lived experience of direct provision, I do not, as numerous photographs and stories about asylum conditions often appear to do, wish to be seen to romanticize, exoticize, or even essentialize my experience or those of other inmates of Highlands Direct Provision Centers. My hope is that by focalizing issues of race, disability, and social isolation, I will be contributing to the creation of efforts at dismantling structures of oppression anywhere they have been erected in the world. As some of you might have guessed, the first part of the title of my talk is a deliberate allusion to that international network of institutions and individuals whose mission is to protect scholars and promote academic freedom. Scholars at Risk Network recognizes the precarity of scholarship as a truth-finding, truth-telling endeavor, but also of the scholar as an endangered political species that is constantly looking over their shoulders, especially if they are applying their trade in a precarious terrain, in places where freedom is threatened by power, or in contexts in which the profession of the scholar is a threat to the very existence of a totalitarian or authoritarian regime. Scholars have always been at odds with people and institutions, including states, who would prefer to hide truth and deceive the people rather than pursue an agenda that would lead the people out of darkness and into light. Now, my reference is to those institutions and people whose proclivity for oppression is for them part of the natural order of things. People and institutions that we often categorize as essentialists in their perception of the world and monologic in their engagements with others. Totalitarian regimes, far-right governments, and right-wing nationalists, and various peoples with toxic political leanings, high-handed elected governments that are intolerant of criticism while masquerading as liberal democrats, various non-governmental institutions purporting to be human rights watchdogs, but who often conveniently look away when human rights are violated or who show tacit support to rogue regimes. These and others of their ilk are a menace to freedom. They are a risk to scholars and to scholarship. Resisting them is no easy task. Hence, the decision by some academics like me to flee the homeland and seek sanctuary in less volatile regions of the world, in places where questioning power may not be met with naked force, or the questioner may not be placing themselves in harm's way. Scholars at Risk Network offer such at-risk scholars protection and a freer environment to continue to do their work unfettered. But it is not only a scholar who needs protection from such toxic power or from forces and situations which threaten freedom. Anyone can become the target of violence or of forces of evil. We live in an increasingly dangerous world, a world in which thinking alone or questing for truth is not the only reason why our lives could be in danger. By simply existing in a place where violence prevails or where the powers that be are at odds with our existence, we stand a fair chance of facing death or of being subjected to oppression and all sorts of degrading treatments. As I speak, there is a war going on in Ukraine, and many have died in that war. Some of those who died had not the foggiest idea that the casus belli was for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Many of them innocent children, women, the elderly, and disabled, died not because they were scholars or because they were engaged in activities which the warring factions consider to be inimical to the perpetuation of their interests. No, they died simply because they happened to live in a wartime Ukraine at a time when it is a risk to be a Ukrainian and live in Ukraine. And it is not only in one's homeland, among fellow autochthonous population of the place one regards as home, that one's situation may become precarious or that one may face the risk of being visited with violence. Forces of evil and evil machinations exist everywhere. They are trans-territorial, transgenerational, and often rely on a copycat system to perpetuate and cause disruptions. The modus operandi may be slightly different, but the terminus at quem is broadly the same, namely to shrink the civic space of engagement, to throttle individual liberty and free speech, to create climates of fear, and to ensure that no one can question the propensity of purveyors of evil to enrich themselves. In parentheses, I should say that I am passing very quickly over the significance of this pattern and would like to direct our attention to an issue of no less importance in our attempt to understand the nature of the risk which positionality makes possible and how it is both a concern at home and abroad. Let's consider, for the purposes of this lecture, the issue of asylum and its attendant risks. People seek asylum or protection for many reasons: protection from the sorts of situation, institutions, and people we have referred to as forces of evil or evildoers, protection from domestic abuse, protection from religious persecution, protection from adverse economic conditions, etc. Whatever the situation that may be responsible for one's flight from home, one could be forgiven for assuming that, having managed to escape any of these adverse situations, one's application for protection in a more salubrious clime would pose no risk. It should be a walk in the park. That was, in my particular experience, what I thought. And quite naively, you would say. Like me, I believe that a lot of asylum seekers never knew that they were putting themselves at risk by seeking protection. They never knew that they were exchanging one precarious situation for another. The latter risk is only barely mitigated by being offered bed and board and exiguous social welfare payments and other basic services in a country with, thankfully, no far-right political party or openly racist political culture. But that is only as far as it goes. After that, the rest is a tale of woe. Now, to place this tale in perspective, let us briefly tease out the basic features of Ireland's protection system. As many of you are aware, Ireland has been pursuing for over 20 years now a policy of lodging thousands of asylum seekers in direct provision accommodation centers for years at a time. These centers, like the one I was placed in with wife and 2 children, are often overcrowded and in unsanitary conditions, with many residents forced to live there for indefinite and often inordinate lengths of stay while awaiting decision on their application. Many of these centers are privately owned and operate based on rules and regulations set by the Reception and Integration Agency, and I think they changed their name now, which I can't remember, and others set by their owners. Now, the standards of accommodation and living conditions vary, and asylum seekers accommodated in each center comprise people from both the global south and the north. While some centers are designed for only single male adults, others, like the one I lived in Galway, are set up to accommodate families with children and or single female adults. Many of these centers are also located outside cities, and I'm quoting Nedeljkovic now, in former convents, army barracks, and hotels on the periphery of society. From the first counts when I came to Ireland, there were as many as 150 direct provision accommodation centers throughout the Irish state, but the number has shot up considerably since then and now includes a number of emergency accommodation centers, mostly hotels and B&Bs, acquired on short-term basis. Now, disquieting as what I'm about to say next may sound, there is a sense in which these centers, like a lot of other purpose-built immigration and asylum facilities around the world, can be likened to concentration camps. In an article in The Guardian, Daniel Trilling, a regular contributor to the magazine and the author of that compelling book, Lights in Distance, Exile and Refuge at the Border of Europe, explains that although the idea of mass internment camps was largely associated with the Nazis, the practice remains with us everywhere and in different forms today, in the shape of a large network of purpose-built immigration prisons in the US, in the guise of political education camps in Western China, in explicit fashion, as we see in torture and mass execution prison complexes in Syria, in the form of detention centers where undocumented immigrants are held, such as exist in Northeast India, and in the kinds of rural encampments in Myanmar, and so on. Now, Trilling likens these centers to concentration camps, and permit me to quote him. We tend to associate, beginning of quote, we tend to associate the idea of concentration camps with their most extreme instances, the Nazis' Holocaust and the Soviet Gulag system, genocide in Cambodia and Bosnia. But the disturbing truth is that concentration camps have been widespread throughout recent history, used to intern civilians that a state considered hostile, to control the movement of people in transit, and to extract forced labor. End of quote. Now, Trilling makes 4 important points about these camps, which allow us to think of Ireland's direct provision system as an example of one such facility systems, even if a benign one. The first is that some of them, like the large network of purpose-built immigration prisons in the US, are run for profit. Now, also, most were established as temporary or emergency measures. Those people who have researched the history of direct provision will tell you that that's how they started. But have outgrown their original stated purpose and become seemingly permanent. And most exist thanks to a mix of legal ambiguity, detention centers operating outside the regular prison system, for instance, and physical isolation. And most, if not all, have at times been described by their critics as concentration camps. Now, following Daniel Trilling, we can think of direct provision as a benign form of concentration camp. And for me, the experience of living in one such centers came with a risk. And some aspects of that risk are embodied in the intersectionality of race, disability, and social isolation that I would address next. Now, let's begin with the question of direct provision as a racist policy. Is anyone still in doubt that any policy that is designed to keep a category of people at bay by moralizing about the legality or otherwise of their existence in any society is, to all intents and purposes, racist? We do not need any serious disquisition to understand that when people are interred and denied basic rights, such as the right to decide for themselves what to eat and when, they are not only constructed as the other, they are also being viewed as social non-person. Now, a social non-person, according to the historian Orlando Patterson, is a marginalized, socially excluded person, like the Irish in London during the period of Great Irish Migration, when a lot of Irish people took the boat. In Britain, these Irish immigrants, described as an unconsidered people by Catherine Dunn in a book of same title, and I quote her, remained on the outskirts of comfort and security, like asylum seekers holed up in direct provision centers in Ireland of today. But unlike present-day asylum seekers in Ireland, these Irish immigrants in Britain were spared the agony of being placed in camps and cared for, as is the case with direct provision, as they were not formal asylum seekers. However, without a shred of doubt, their experience was racism. And it would be disingenuous for anyone to claim that what asylum seekers face today in Ireland is not racism. Because racism is such a political hot potato, and the reference to potato is very deliberate. We often tiptoe around it, pretending that in direct provision, for example, what is at play is not racism. Well, as one who has been through the direct provision system, I can confidently assert that my experience of racism is not only in the form of direct provision writ large, but also in the way in which I was singled out for poor treatment on account of my ethnicity, and I dare say skin color. 4, how else do you explain a situation in which I was consistently ignored by a racist center manager when I complained of being allocated to a room with no disability access and fitted with a bathtub, which was clearly not suitable for me? While I was ignored, rooms that could better meet my needs were allocated to other people, especially asylum seekers of Eastern European descent. This is one example out of several others. But sometimes the experience, that is, of racism, was more subtle and may be carefully concealed behind officialese. Sometimes it was in the form of the use of racial slurs by some people outside direct provision upon hearing that one was an asylum seeker. Sometimes, too, it was in the shape of microaggression, like when a bus driver just outside the hotel where we lived would pretend not to see me approaching in my wheelchair and would quickly admit a white female passenger with a boogie, even when the space the passenger had taken was clearly meant for a wheelchair. At other times, racism was manifested as an in-your-face aggression. Once, for example, I was stopped by 2 elderly white women in front of the hotel where I lived, and they demanded to know why I was in Ireland and where I came from. They were very displeased as they glared at me. At first, I was taken aback by the aggressive way they were throwing questions at me. Then when I understood that they were probably part of a disgruntled section of society, a humorous part of me that often comes handy at moments like that asserted itself. Looking levelly at them, I replied that I came from Timbuktu and rode on a horse to Ireland. But humor may not always save every situation. And when you're a disabled person in direct provision, humor is the least likely resource to fall upon as you confront a different, no less pernicious layer of marginality and exclusion. From the first moment I arrived at Balseskin Reception Center after putting in my application for protection to the last moment I left direct provision with my family 3 years later, my experience as a disabled person was shaped, for the most part, by official neglect, threats, and outright abuse. Aside from being allocated to a room on the 3rd floor of a hotel where the lift often broke down and I was forced to have my wheelchair carried downstairs while I struggled in tow, I was also forced to make do with a bathroom fitted with bathtub despite my condition as a wheelchair user. I had to rely on my wife to get in and out of the bathtub, and it was always a grueling experience. At this point, you're probably wondering, but didn't you notify the authorities concerned with the welfare of asylum seekers? Didn't you tell them about your needs? Oh, I did. Right from the first week we were housed in Balseskin, or should I say warehoused, I wrote a letter to IPAS and notified them of my situation and family composition. I knew we would be transferred to a more permanent center after our initial accommodation at Balseskin. And so I wrote a letter to IPAS to forestall a situation where we could be transferred to a place that may not be disability friendly. I sent in a request twice, first by post, then by email. IPAS never replied, nor acknowledged the correspondence. My family, just to reiterate again, was allocated to a single standard hotel room with a door that could not admit me and my wheelchair at the same time. I always left the wheelchair to crawl into our room while the wheelchair would have to be collapsed before it could fit through the door. Same process was repeated when I went out. A request to be transferred to another accommodation center or at least to a more suitable room within the same center was ignored or became an occasion for the invocation of some duplicitous safety concerns or outright threats. Our room was furnished with a bed that was much too high for me to climb, and for a while I slept on the floor until a public health nurse intervened and was supplied with an adjustable bed. However, I was not lucky with my request to have our room changed or to be transferred to a different accommodation center, despite the intervention of an occupational therapist who wrote a damning report about our living situation. I can go on and on about these experiences, and there were many of them indeed. But what I wish to stress, by way of moving on to the third discursive field in our consideration of the intersectionality of race, disability, and social isolation, is that direct provision system impinges on the subjectivities of asylum seekers in ways that are quite disquieting. An important area where we might usefully apprehend the impact of the system on asylum seekers is in how it's ontologically, it is an ontological condition that affects, that limits the rights of people that we consider to be living in the margin of society. Here, I refer to the idea of social isolation, which every asylum seeker in direct provision must grapple with, and which manifests in different areas of one's life. I view the isolation of asylum seekers as a form of state violence that is predicated on three existential conditions, acting separately or in consonance to reinforce how asylum seekers are enthralled to a system that subjugates them. The first of these conditions is the physical location of the places where asylum seekers are housed, as well as the structural conditions of their dwellings. The second is the degree of social and cultural integration, which the condition of being an asylum seeker allows, while the third refers to the kinds of discriminatory practices that prevent asylum seekers from fully integrated and are socially from living fully integrated and a socially active life as they would like to enjoy. The first of these conditions is less often commented upon, because having a roof over one's head, no matter in what condition, one should be counted as should count it as a blessing in a country besieged by housing crisis. Not one of these conditions wished on anyone, but the last two are, in my opinion, more damaging of one's mental health and overall well-being than the first. It is possible to survive physical isolation, and many are, in fact, known to have quickly adapted to living in the peripheries of the center and have managed to thrive despite the strictures against them. But only a few can remain undamaged when isolated socially and culturally. Until only a few years ago, asylum seekers were denied the right to work, the right to education, the right to Irish driving license, and the right to open and own a bank account. Even today, the so-called work permit that is granted to asylum seekers has only a 6-month lifespan, with all sorts of unfavorable conditionalities attached to it. One fails to see the logic behind a policy that tries to limit the participation of asylum seekers in the job market, except perhaps to think that, as one Irish politician infamously said, immigrants are only in Ireland to sponge off the system. But we know that arguments about asylum seekers, refugees being leeches on the welfare state are at the root of much of the pushback from the right, and some of the left spreading fears about white replacement and the economic burden of admitting refugees, asylum seekers into Europe. However, as some critics like the British sociologist Gominda Bambara have noted, our recent experience with the COVID-19 pandemic has made obvious the extent to which European nations are empirically multicultural and indeed could not function without their ethnic minority citizens and migrant populations, both settled and temporary. It is precisely these populations across the continent that are disproportionately carrying the burden of maintaining the health and lives of national populations under lockdown. Now, Pio Hansen, in A Modern Migration Theory, has also disrupted the widely accepted but deeply misleading narrative that the increasing presence of migrants in continental Europe is inimical to the sustenance of the welfare state. Hansen's insights are derived from modern monetary theory, and he demonstrates that there is no economic cost to migration that is borne by the host population. Indeed, he shows that the real-world consequence of Sweden's response to so-called refugee crisis of 2015 was the opposite of what most politicians and scholars had predicted, and which many still believe, that spending on refugees integration was not a cost, but a means of investing in people for real resources and welfare, something which stimulated the economy. So instead of undermining the welfare state, it made welfare viable for the whole population, a political truth that takes on a new resonance in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. For many asylum seekers, one of the most insidious risks of living in direct provision is an unwitting submission to social death in one's profession. A lot of asylum seekers have found themselves in situations in which they are unable to make progress in their careers due to their exclusion from and their experience of discrimination in the labor market. Many have had to change their profession, often to mental tasks like cleaning or working as a porter, while many others have switched to other professions, especially in healthcare, after a period of short-term training or schooling. Lack of a work permit covering an indefinite period of time, or a Garda National Immigration Bureau card, which is often demanded by employers alongside a driver's license, and which is now being issued to asylum seekers, often act as a stumbling block to getting a job that would help further one's career. They also have to contend with the subterraneously racist Irish labor market, which, as the sociologist Ebru Joseph has shown in her studies of Black labor mobility in Ireland, is structurally organized to put Black migrants at a disadvantage. According to Joseph, Black Africans reported higher rates of employment-based discrimination in Europe, and I quote her, the labor market participation of most Black Africans in Ireland starts with a downward mobility which can last for up to 2 to 8 years, depending on their route of entry into Ireland. I'm bringing this to conclusion now. The intersectionality of race, disability, and social isolation in direct provision system is part of an overarching pattern of inequality and oppression that are at the heart of the toxic present historic moment of global pushback against immigration and multiculturalism. If we examine, however, causally, the resurgence of right-wing nationalism in recent times, we will see how this pattern plays out from Donald Trump to Bolsonaro, and from Modi to Orbán or Duterte. There appears to be a universal template that is followed by social actors and institutions committed to the stifling of individual liberty and freedom. While this pattern may seem to unproblematically hark back to an earlier period, such as the fascism of the 1930s, some activist scholars have alerted us to why it is useful to see it in terms of continuities and transformation. According to the historian Robin Kelly, the recent resurgence of right-wing nationalism under a growing list of modern authoritarian leaders does not necessarily mark a break from neoliberalism or fascism redux. Permit me to quote Robin. Rather, it represents both a continuation of neoliberal logic and a new historic bloc comprising extreme right-wing fundamentalists, corporate interests, and a portion of disaffected working people to form a new authoritarian, neo-fascist movement ruled by fear but governed by neoliberalism. And what is to be done? I don't think we need shy away from anthropological consumption. Perhaps the more of our stories we share, the more we are able to cause a much needed political awakening against forces of oppression. I thank you all for your kind attention, and thank you for having me.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ogunsanya. Just in a moment now, we'll start our Q&A. So I'll pop a message into the chat as well, but if our attendees have any questions, you're very welcome to put them into the chat, and we'll start to moderate the Q&A now in just 1 minute. We're just having a connection issue. Thanks, everybody. I see we have one question has come in from our colleague, Dr. Cleena Murphy. So I can read that out for you, Dr. Ogunsanya, but it's also there in the chat if you'd like to read it. So Cleena, thanking you very much for this really thought-provoking and wide-ranging lecture. So the question is that while she understands that vulnerability assessments have been recently introduced for people with disabilities living in direct provision, would you have any confidence that this would make a difference to daily living conditions, or are the problems too deeply embedded or structural in nature?
I didn't quite catch that last. Could you repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, no problem. So it's about the vulnerability assessments that have been recently introduced for people with disabilities who live in provision. So do you think this will make a difference, or are the problems maybe too deeply embedded or structural to be overcome?
Oh, well, yeah. I thank you very much for this question.
Apologies, everybody. I think we might be having a bit of a connection issue on campus today, so we'll just wait 1 moment and see if it resolves.
Am I on? Am I back on? I think there was a disruption with the internet.
You're back, yeah. I think there was a moment there where it dropped out. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so I was saying that it was something I thought I could put into the lecture, but I'm glad that it has come now in the form of a question. Yeah, so the white government published the white paper sometime last year and said they were committing themselves to ending direct provision. And one of the provisions of that white paper was the introduction of vulnerability assessments, which would also cover people with disability in direct provision. I do not have much confidence in this, and I'll tell you why. So there is an ongoing research conducting on behalf of NASC, Migrant and Refugee Rights Center, and I've been, conducting interviews with current residents of direct provision, and I've asked many of them, those who have not, especially those who have not spent up to a year or maybe about a year in the system, and no one has been able to tell me that any kind of vulnerability assessment is being carried out. Maybe I have not spoken to as many people as possible, but I've spoken to more than 20 people on this, spread across different direct provision centers. It's the same thing, the same kind of treatment that you receive, the same kind of, dismissive attitude. So whether it is going to be effective or not is not, for me, the first question. The first question is whether government is sincere and will sincerely commit to carrying out a vulnerability assessment. When I was in direct provision, I practically begged for a vulnerability assessment. Apart from writing letters, for the most part, I was cap in hand, going from one institute or the other, one organization or the other, until I think post-polio island, really came to the rescue. So really, I don't see I don't know if anything is really going to change, but I also think that these things are very complex. There is a way in which they are intersectionally complex. Let me share an experience with you. After we got our papers and I was trying to apply for, disability allowance, I at one point I had to ask that my photograph be taken in sitting on the floor in our room with my calipers beside me and my pair of crutches, and had the picture sent to the social welfare department to convince them that I'm actually a disabled person, because 2, 3, 4 times they rejected my application. Now, I don't know if this is the situation for other people who are not in direct provision, but I'm forced to reach one conclusion, which is that because I was in a direct provision and the address I used was that of a direct provision, it was questionable that, my whatever claim I was making was questionable. So I really do not have much confidence in the question in this until there's a commitment that is seen and can be attested to by people in direct provision.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ogunsanya. This is Fergus Ryan here. And sorry, I had some technical issues at the beginning. So I was meant to be sort of sharing questions, and my apologies for the confusion. I just first wanted to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, a really illuminating and thoughtful and powerful presentation rooted in personal experience. I know people have questions, and I don't want to take up time in relation to express my own views when other people have questions. So I just noticed there that Bargabi Das has written in the chat. I don't know, Bargabi, do you want to come in and ask a question directly, or would you like me to read your question?
I wouldn't mind just coming in. Is that okay?
Absolutely. No, you're very welcome, Bargabi.
Yeah. Hi, I just wanted to say that was an absolutely brilliant talk. I have so many observations, and I just wanted to quickly say kudos for bringing in the detention camps in Northeast India with the same line as direct provision system here. I think that was something that's given me so much thought to kind of, do my own research on. I actually quickly have questions. I've seen several brown people have racist stereotype notions in regard to Black people, but more so Black people in direct provisions. I have friends calling these spaces as unsafe, unhygienic, etc., etc. So, how do you see this situation in light of your current talk, wherein state violence has spilled over towards communities who claim and often do face racism in Ireland themselves? And how can collective resistance among such groups who faces racism in Ireland at different levels happen really? So thank you.
Thank you very much. Some of these things are very complex, as with a lot of areas of social domain, complex because now sometimes we talk about Black on Black racism, brown on Black racism, white on Black racism, even white on white racism, and so on. And when we have situations like that, there is often the problem of presenting a collective front, a united front against what really is the problem, which is, say, racism. There are indirect provision. It's not only white people that you have as residents. You have, it's not only Black people that you have as residents. You have, brown colored people with brown color. You have even people with white color, maybe from Eastern Europe, and so on. And amongst them, you have all kinds of racism also taking place. Sometimes, and people are not talking about this a lot until you have people who can talk from within. Very often, we glide over such things and just keep quiet. You know, I have heard and seen muffled voices complaining that, oh, center managers like to just give some of the best rooms and things to those Eastern Europeans. I think because they also are whites like them. And then you have Zimbabwean, South Africans, you know, sometimes quarreling and saying, see, those Nigerians, don't mind them. And then, so you have to go into places like sometimes where they wash clothes and so on, laundries, to hear that, oh, these some whites, some Zimbabweans descended on some woman who is a Nigerian, and then they started shouting and abusing her and saying this. And for me, when I think of these things, I think of them as, you know, the human condition, you know. Of course, we know that some of them are motivated by racism, you know. So it becomes a problem, therefore, to galvanize or mobilize a collective effort, you know, towards confronting that big elephant in the room. And it is because everyone that should be involved, or most people that should be involved, are themselves guilty of the same thing, you know. So you're talking about, say, an Indian, for instance, showing some racist attitude towards a black person, and then the black person then looks back and say, "Look at you! Even in your own country, can you see what Modi and so on, what they're doing?" You know, so it's very messy. It's a very messy situation. But the truth is that we cannot stop. We can't say because, oh, this one too is doing this, that is doing that. We cannot confront, or we shouldn't confront the same enemy. We recognize the enemy. We all know what the enemy is. You know, it's about time we stopped tiptoeing around it and say that, look, this is racism. Whether my skin is black, brown, or white, or whatever, we all should confront the thing headlong. Not too long ago, and I alluded to this in my lecture. Not too long ago, even the Irish, the Irish, you know, where we are, had to reinvent themselves and become white, you know, and because they were not historically considered as white. And so you had places where they wrote in those days, blacks, dogs, and the Irish, you know. So if we have this kind of thing at the back of our mind, we would realize that, look, today may be your turn. I mean, today may be yours. Tomorrow may be somebody else's turn. And that we have a common enemy to deal with, you know, whether you're white, you're black, or you're brown. This is evil, and it is one that we must confront headlong. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ogunsanya. And and thank you, Bargabi, for that question as well. I'm sure there are lots of more questions and that Bargabi might like to ask, but I noticed that Cynthia Olufade has a question in the chat saying, thank you for being such a strong voice, Dr. Ogunsanya. I'm particularly interested, she says, in the intersection of the media in this discourse. Are they more sympathetic to the state or more interested in presenting the situation as it is? And the place of nonprofits and NGOs did not also come up. So I wonder maybe if you could address that particular question about the media and the role that the media play, because I know that you have a particular specialism in media and anthropology.
Well, you know, the media is deeply complicit in this. Even when the media, in all of this, the media is deeply complicit. It is true that sometimes we'd say that, oh, the media is also trying to highlight some of these issues. Again, you want to ask from what perspective, and are they doing it? Are they doing it? Is the media doing enough? You know, when you compare, for example, the way the Ukrainian crisis is being reported with the way, say, the crisis in Syria, Afghanistan is being reported. I did reported the same way, you know. Oh, we've never seen this before when you're talking about Ukraine. Oh, you know, this, that, and so on. Is it because Ukraine is right at your doorstep, you know, because you share the same continent, you know, and then, you know, they become human beings. You are very quickly humanizing them, you know, and then you saying that, oh, we've not seen this. When Crimea happened only yesterday, haven't you always seen it? It has always happened, you know. But when you need to talk about Syria and talk about Afghanistan or talk about some crisis in places in Africa, it becomes, oh, well, it's endemic. They're always like that, you know, and then you just pass it on. You pass it over. You know, the same kind of attitude has now seeped into the way we treat Ukrainian refugees and the way we treat people who have been seeking asylum, who have been in direct provision for so long, you know. So suddenly the Ukrainians are that special breed, you know, that has to be given all the attention. Whereas the other people that were housed for so long, you know, some of them have been in that place for months. They've not even got their blue card. The others have been welcomed with a party at the airport. Thank you. That's my response.
Thank you, Dr. Ogunsanya. I mean, that's a particularly important point, how the media, I suppose, have framed the Ukrainian situation compared to Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, and many places in the world where there is conflict. A particularly particular challenge there, I think, to the media is how they, you know, why they are approaching the Ukrainian situation so differently from so many others, and so many interesting questions there. I know that Dr. Zoriana Saik has a question. I don't know if I mispronounced your name, but Zoriana, if you want to come in there.
Hi, Fergus. Thank you so much. I'm not a doctor yet, but I'm hoping to be one day. But thank you so much. That speaks to me so nice. Thank you. Dr. Abayomi, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your experience and for actually conducting such a research. I had lived in the direct provision myself for 6 years, from 2006 to 2012. And so your experience has deeply resonated with me. I actually remember a man on crutches who wasn't able to go up the stairs in one of the direct provision centers. There was a lift, but the lift was blocked and the man was not allowed, and he was housed on the third floor, actually, with his family, and he was not allowed to use the lift. So it's, you know, and your experience quite recent, and it is really sad that seems we are talking about the changes of the system for so many years, however, nothing changed, you know, so it's really sad and disheartening. So if I could ask you, I'd like to ask you two questions. So the first question that I would like to ask you is, if you could maybe comment from your observation, maybe regarding experiences of women in the direct provision system. Obviously, you know, your wife and how she was able to cope with raising her children, and the intersectionality of the oppression, experiences of oppression for women in the direct provision system. That's the first question. And the second question, I know you mentioned this already. As it happens, I am Ukrainian, and so I have observed the inequality in treatment. You know, I have the experience of the direct provision system, and obviously, as a Ukrainian person, I'm very happy the way Ireland and the whole world responded to the absolutely horrific atrocities that are happening in Ukraine and the way they treat my people. But at the same time, my heart is breaking for my Syrian friends, for my Afghani friends, and others who are in the direct provision and they don't have access to the benefits, but they don't even have access to the empathy that Ukrainian people experience. So I know you already touched on that, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the implications of the treatment of Ukrainian people? Because this morning I saw an article saying that, you know, a number of places that are offered should be capped for Ukrainian refugees. And, you know, so there is like shared goodness and goodwill and empathy and everything, but unfortunately it tends to get lost in every day, you know. And so obviously media can play a huge account in that, how they name the articles to bring the attention and so on and so forth. But there is a deeper implication that can occur. So I just wanted to ask you what those deeper implications that can occur from the treatment of Ukrainian, I wanted to say refugees, but I've been asked, actually, you know, in some places when I used Ukrainian refugee, I was asked that, or I was told so, that we don't use Ukrainian refugees, we use temporary protection status. However, for me, it's also looking at what is happening. I think a lot of Ukrainian people would agree that they are refugees. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Thank you so much. Looking forward to your response.
Yeah. So there are two parts to your question. First, I would like to say that I'm really delighted that you have asked this question and to be meeting you. About a month and a half ago, I joined one of the massive meetings, and you were there to talk about University of Sanctuary. And I heard you were from Ukraine and that you lived in direct provision. I said, "Woo, I must talk to her one day," you know, because at that time the question of this disproportionate, this unequal treatment had started engaging my mind, and I wanted to, you know, ask how you're feeling about it, you know. So it's good that in a way you are now sending that kind of question my way, you know. First, let's start with the experience of women. I think that yes, I'm not a woman, so I would not be able to do justice to this, but I can speak from the perspective of someone whose wife has been and always been his primary carer. So I've been intimately a part of that experience with her in direct provision. And I would say that, like everyone else, you know, whether you're a man, a woman, a child, the impact on the system, on you, on your functioning as a social being, you know, is deeply, very deeply affected in a very negative way, you know. For my wife, for instance, there is even another layer of that oppression, you know, of that concern, because look, she has children to take care of, but she also has this husband who is in wheelchair, you know. So she's impacted in multiple ways, you know, while struggling to help the children. We try, both of us, to care for them together. But she's also in a way trying also to care for me, you know. But let's show, what about women who do not have our own kind of situation? It's not an easy thing. I know of family of people with 4 children holed up in one room and have talked about how a woman, for instance, is unable to dress, put on a dress whenever their oldest son is in the room, you know, how she would have to excuse herself or ask him to excuse her and so on. It's difficult. I honestly don't know, but look, let's simply say it's difficult. And interpret that it's difficult in many multiple ways, you know. Now, the other part of the question about how the treatment of Ukrainians. See, I'm an anthropologist. I do not believe in making sweeping statements. I believe in unearthing stories that are very from the people's stories that you get right from the horse's mouth. So I'll give you this example. I spoke to a woman last week as part of the research on ending direct ask, and asked her about her experience. I mean, she came into the system less than a year ago. No, less than 6 months ago. And she said that, in fact, she was saying this and was almost crying. She said, look, my children have not been able to go to school. They just abandoned us here. Up till now, we have not been able to get our blue card. But you know what? Immediately they brought those Ukrainians. They started putting their children in school. And we thought this was very unfair. So we had a demonstration. You know, we came out of the hotel and demonstrated. And immediately, 2 days later, they started, school started coming and asking us to bring our children to enroll them. You know, now the implication of this for intergroup relations is that there will be serious animus by one group against the other. So when you see Ukrainians, you feel, so what's so special about you? Is it because you have a white skin? That's one of the unintended consequences of this kind of quote unquote, because that's the only way I can see it. I say it, divide and rule situation. You know, you talk to people who came in some months ago and they just practically been left where they are, and you see them saying that, or you hear them saying that, oh, but these people just came yesterday. They already have their blue card. They already have PPS number. You know, their children are already going to school. You know, so you feel so angry that sometimes you don't even want to talk to those people, forgetting that you are actually misplacing your anger. Your anger should be against the forces that made that situation possible, and not the people that have been treated, you know, better than you have been treated. You know, so, and this can go on and acquire a deep root, such that, I mean, we know when you study intergroup relations very carefully, this is how this kind of thing starts. During my PhD research a number of years back, I researched about Hausa people in southwest Nigeria, and part of it also looked at Yoruba people in the north of Nigeria. You know, and I realized that the creation of Sabo locations are like ghettoist communities, you know, was by the colonialists, and the purpose was to ensure that the so-called indigenous people did not mix with those who came from other parts of the country. Now, you did that because you wanted to preserve a certain kind of northern identity and religion and so on. But years later, the situation became very bad, because then you have created a subaltern class, a subaltern community that can be preyed upon, you know, and that the others see as, you know, over-pampered, privileged, and so on. And then you want to direct your anger at them. That's the kind of thing that can happen, you know. I hope I've been able to say something about
You
that.
did, absolutely. I just wanted to thank you for sharing those stories, because I remember one of those ladies, she was actually in the direct provision center with the Ukrainian people, which kind of was even worse, you know, because it's almost like the othering that is happening is happening also openly in such a small scale issues like the school plays. And I was thinking, you know, as educators, we really need to work on conflict resolutions for those groups and create space for education, for learning from all people's experience. So as you say, that they would be supportive of each other, because at the end of the day, they are all looking for sanctuary. They're all looking for support in face of the wars and atrocities. My biggest worry would be that this division, this othering, can be used by the far right. And I know there have been many attempts for them feeding on people's division in Ireland. And I really hope that, you know, maybe we can work together on something, you know, and we can you know, support both communities. But thank you so much for giving the voice to people in the direct provision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's so nice to have you on this talk.
Thank you, Zoriana, and my apologies. I dropped out there because for technical problems. But thank you so much for your questions and for asking them. And I know also that Hira Khan has a question as well. Hira Khan is a student in on the LLB in Maynooth University, and she has asked us to ask you about, I suppose, a future direct provision or future, I suppose, of services in particular for, if that's the right word, or how we go about having a better system effectively for asylum seekers and refugees in Ireland. What do you envisage ideally as replacing direct provision, particularly given that the apparently government policy to get to eliminate or to remove direct provision and replace it with something else? But what would that ideally look like? What if you were advising the minister? What would that ideally look like?
I've been asked this question repeatedly in the past, and my answer has always been that first, I personally do not have a solution or an answer that can fit all. Because look, there are all kinds of arguments about why direct provision was introduced, why it has been kept till now, why it is difficult to dismantle it, and so on and so forth. To the point that, if I am correct, I think a certain university in this country endowed a PhD study to come up with an alternative to direct provision, you know, and I think someone is currently working on that, you know. So it's hard. It's also a potential banana peel. So when you have to respond to it, you have to think very carefully, because one of the things you want to ask yourself is, so when people come and they say they are seeking asylum, what do you do? Do you immediately, because look, these are people who are vulnerable, do you immediately put them in a house and give them all the supplies, especially in a place where there is purportedly a housing crisis? Do you immediately allow them to start driving, even when you know that they could pose some risks to, you know, when you're not too sure if, you know, do you immediately throw them into the labor market and so on? You know, I'm not saying these are issues to be considered or that they're so important to be considered. No, I'm saying that those who have expressed pushbacks against it have come up with issues like this. So, but to cut to the chase, I do not have any solution. I do not have, frankly, personally, do not have any suggestion or an alternative to it. The only thing, however, that I can say is that whatever approach, whatever is to be done, must be whatever policy is to be pursued must have at the very heart of it, human consideration. It must recognize human rights, because one of the, for example, the biggest reason we kick against direct provision is because it is an infringement on human rights. You know, when you lay it all bare and you look at all the parts, you realize that it is an affront, it is a violence that is visited on people, it is a deliberate attempt to emasculate them, to subjugate them, you know, to make them very useless to themselves and to the system. And I don't understand what the system wants to gain from doing that. For example, you keep people hold up like this for, say, 5 years, 6 years, and by the time they are out of the system, they have to start learning to live again. They have to start learning to understand who they are. They have to, sometimes they can't even fit back into what they've always been or into the system that they've come into. They can't fit into it, you know, after 5, 6 years. And I'm not here talking academics. I'm talking about people that I know, living flesh and blood, people that I've talked to, you know. What about those, for example, who, you know, I was an established academic before coming to Ireland, but you see, sometimes when I even think of some of the kinds of things I went through, I just laugh. Imagine someone with a PhD having to go enroll for a QI level 5 course just so that, just to be able to do something, you know. So it's difficult. It's also messy, but we have to confront it. The white paper that government released last year has shown some, you know, really very good steps, initiatives, but commitment to it is it's something else. You know, you promised that. The only part of it that I think that seems to, because there are still many people who would tell you that I don't think that is the truth, seems to be working, is that, okay, people now have less time to wait for decisions on their application, you know. But that is, as I said, talking about some people, maybe not everyone, you know. But in terms of how people live, how people are made to live, nothing is changing. Instead, it's getting even worse than it has always been. So yeah, to reiterate, I honestly, frankly, do not have anything else that can be a replacement. I do not.
Thank you for that. Jenny has actually put the Department of Justice report of the advisory group on the provision of support for people in the international protection process, put that into the chat, and thank you, Jenny, for that. And I think, I mean, one thing that resonated for me was your mention of isolation. That it seems to me that direct provision, to some extent, seeks, I don't know if this is the purpose of it, but seeks to prevent people from integrating into communities. You speak about people being social non-persons, a kind of a social death of sorts, and not being able to join in local communities. That, in a sense, is direct provision almost designed to prevent integration, do you think?
Yeah. I think that's frankly what it is. You see, it's when you talk to people from the Department of Justice, or, you know, I can't remember what IPAS is called now. Now, they keep telling you that, what their intention is to integrate. They talk about integration, they talk, you know, well, it's lip service. Because when you honestly look at how things are done, look, let's scratch above the surface. Let's go deeper. Sit people down, people who live in direct provision, ask them candidly to tell you about how they are perceived, and or how they think that they are perceived, and how such perception is affecting them, you know, how it is shaping their subjectivities, you know, how they are, and they will tell you that, look, I think these people they seem not to like me or want me in this place, you know. So you hear of, but there are all kinds of programs, sanctuary runners, you can do volunteer work, and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of barriers which we can't begin to list here. Sometimes it is in where some of these direct provision centers are located. I interviewed someone who told me that, look, to get to where I can at least offer myself for some kind of volunteering is I would have to take like 3 buses because where our hostel is located is so far away, you know. And I asked, well, what about the locals? Do you try to mingle with them, maybe make friends and so on? Say, is it not people that are ready to make friends with you that you'd make friends with? You understand what I mean? And our attitudes are shaped by all kinds of perceptions. There are those that they won't say it, but maintaining the so-called upper lip and trying to breathe it under their breath to tell you that, say it under their breath to tell you that all those people, they are not educated. You can't, they won't even understand you, but you have not even made any effort to make them, to understand them. You are not curious enough to want to understand what stuff they are made of, who they are, Look, it is only social non-persons that we treat that way. You have to be sufficiently interested in their humanity. And that starts from how you treat them, what you give them, where you house them, But when you are not interested in that, you are going to play up the usual stereotype. Oh, they've come to sponge off the system, forgetting that these are the same people you use in your healthcare. These are the same people you put in the very precarious places to work,
Thank you, Dr. Ogunsanya. I'm just conscious that we're coming up to 3:30 and the scheduled end of our discussion. I know that John O'Kelly has in the chat said thank you to Dr. Ogunsanya and all of the contributors. Has been really comprehensive and educational critique of direct provision and international protection system, and especially with regard to vulnerability assessment, a damning indictment of it, and the lack of government urgency taking until the end of 2024 to replace direct provision is alarming. Moyna, I think that's Moyna Sullivan, I'm not sure, I said thank you for very much for your moving and important lecture. Dr. Ogunsanya has several comments there just saying thank you so much. I'm not sure if anyone else has any other questions before we finish the event. Let's do lots of thank yous there. Thanks to everybody for contributing. So perhaps unless there are any other questions, or indeed, Dr. Ogunsanya, if you'd like to add anything that hasn't been covered.
No, it's simply to say thank you so much for giving me this platform. I consider it a great honor and a great privilege, and I'm not going to take it for granted. I know that, as I said in the course of the lecture, that I speak for a disempowered community, but I also know that in doing so, I'm opening myself up to, maybe other kinds of criticism, because as Gayatri Spivak says, who speaks for the subaltern? But I think that I am knowledgeable enough to speak for the subaltern, and I'm glad that I've been able to do that. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for the platform. I truly am grateful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ogunsanya, for a wonderful presentation, and particularly powerful. And I think what is most important, I think, to me, is that it's rooted very much in your own personal experience. There's such power in autoethnographic research and ethnographic research generally, but particularly in ethnographic research that draws from one's own personal experience. That is a particularly powerful. I think you've been very frank and very and appropriately frank about your experience in the system, about direct provision, and how I think it is a form of almost secondary victimization that people who are seeking refuge in Ireland really need to have already been through such oppression and challenges in their home countries, and also in traveling to Ireland. And it seems that our system, rather than actually caring for people, looking after people, and recognizing you know, the terrible situation that people are coming from seems to compound that. And I think as the Intersectionality Working Group, we are particularly interested in how intersecting identities can further compound and effectively cause great distress and added distress to people who are fleeing from very oppressive and difficult situations. So thank you so much for your thought-provoking, powerful and illuminating discussion of the topic, academically very erudite, but also rooted in your own personal experience as well. So we're very thankful to you, and I wanted to thank also everybody who has been involved and who asked questions. But thank you also to everybody who's joined us today for the presentation. This is particularly been hosted by the Intersectionality Working Group for the Gender Equality Steering Group, the Athena Swan Group at Maynooth University, and we look forward actually to hearing from Dr. Ogunsanya again soon. And just to note that Dr. Ogunsanya has participated and written a number of pieces, but in particular, you can read more of Dr. Ogunsanya's work in Helen Fallon, I Am a Man of Peace, Writings inspired by the Maynooth University Ken Saro-Wiwa collection, and that is available on the Maynooth University mural website. There's a link there. Jenny Rothwell has put a link in the chat as well. So thanks again to Dr. Ogunsanya and everybody who has participated today. And I think we'll close off the meeting. Thank you so much.